With blood streaming from his wounds and only a hunting knife in hand, the Apache warrior stood between four terrified white orphans and the snarling wolf pack that had already broken through the cabin window. The children whose people had brought disease that killed his family would become the healing his shattered soul never knew it needed. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter of 1878 descended upon the mountains of Arizona Territory with merciless fury, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Snow blanketed the rugged terrain, transforming familiar paths into treacherous puzzles that only the most experienced trackers could decipher. The wind cut through the pines with a voice that sounded like ancient spirits lamenting, carrying whispers of those who had perished in seasons past. It was the kind of cold that burned the lungs and froze tears before they could fall. Nahilzai moved like a ghost across this frozen world. At 43 winters, his body bore the marks of a life lived in harmony with the harsh beauty of his ancestral lands. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a map of deep lines that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw was a reminder of a battle with a mountain lion years before, a story etched into his flesh that the children of his tribe once begged him to tell around evening fires. But Nahilzai no longer told stories by the communal fires. 3 winters ago, the sickness that the white settlers had brought swept through his village like an invisible enemy that no warrior could fight. In the span of 2 moons, he had watched helplessly as the fever claimed his wife, Talasi, whose name meant corn tassel, and whose laughter had once been as musical as summer rain. And then, one by one, his 3 children followed their mother into the Shadowlands. First his son Ahote, then his daughters Kimi and little Doli, who had only seen 5 summers. Since that time, Nahilzai had chosen solitude. He had built his shelter far from the remaining members of his tribe, high in the mountains, where the silence matched the emptiness in his heart. The elders had respected his need to grieve alone, though Chieftain Hoki reminded him that a man cannot live without a people any more than a finger can live when cut from a hand. Nahilzai had merely nodded, neither agreeing nor refusing the wisdom. He hunted alone. He tracked alone. And in the stillness of night, he sat before small fires and spoke to the spirits of his family, telling them of the changing seasons and the movements of the stars, believing that somehow, somewhere, they could hear. On this particular morning, as the sun struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds, Nahilzai followed the tracks of an elk herd. The animals had moved down from the higher elevations, seeking shelter from the storm that had raged for 3 days. Their hoofprints told the story of their journey, where they had stopped to paw through snow for hidden grass, where a young calf had stumbled, where they had changed direction after sensing a predator. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it a scent that made Nahilzai pause. Smoke. Not the rich, earthy smoke of an Apache fire, but the sharper smell of pine burning in a settler's stove. He stood motionless, his dark eyes scanning the distance. White settlers rarely ventured this far into the mountains, especially during winter. Those who did were either lost, desperate, or foolish, sometimes all 3. Curiosity and caution battled within him. The uneasy peace between his people and the white settlers was fragile at best. Just 2 moons ago, a group of soldiers had attacked a small hunting party from a neighboring tribe, killing 3 warriors who had done nothing more than cross an invisible boundary that existed only on the white man's maps. Yet something pulled at him, an inexplicable urge to investigate. Perhaps it was the unusual location, or perhaps it was something deeper, a whisper from the spirits that guided his people. Nahilzai adjusted his course, moving silently through the trees, his moccasins leaving barely a trace in the fresh snow. His rifle, a prized Winchester he had traded for with 20 beaver pelts, was slung across his back. At his waist hung his hunting knife and a smaller skinning blade, both kept razor sharp. As he crested a small ridge, he caught sight of the source of the smoke, a small cabin nestled against the base of a cliff, partially sheltered from the wind. It was one of the abandoned mining cabins, built years ago during a brief silver rush that had proven less fruitful than its eager prospectors had hoped. Most had been left to rot, claimed by the forest and winter storms, but this one showed signs of life. Thin smoke curled from its stone chimney, rising like a pale finger against the grey sky. No horses were visible, no tracks around the perimeter except for... Nahilzai's eyes narrowed. Wolf tracks, many of them, circling the cabin, some fresh enough that the edges had not yet been softened by falling snow. His gaze followed their path to the tree line, where shadows moved between the pines. Wolves, driven by winter hunger, drawn to something in that cabin. Something or someone. Instinct told him to turn away. Whatever drama was unfolding in that small human outpost was not his concern. The white man's troubles were his own. Yet he did not move. Instead, he stood watching as the light began to fade from the sky, feeling the weight of a decision not yet made, but somehow already known. As dusk settled over the mountains, Nahilzai made his decision. He would observe the cabin through the night and continue his hunt at dawn. Finding a position among the rocks that offered both concealment and a clear view, he wrapped himself in his buffalo hide and prepared for the long hours of darkness. The temperature dropped sharply as the stars emerged, brilliant and cold against the black canvas of the sky. His breath formed clouds of vapor that dissipated into the night. The wolves grew bolder as darkness claimed the forest, 7 of them, lean and hungry, their ribs visible beneath winter-thin coats. They approached the cabin with increasing confidence, circling, testing the perimeter, occasionally pawing at the door or sniffing along the single small window. Their behavior puzzled Nahilzai. Wolves rarely showed such persistent interest in human dwellings unless drawn by something specific, food, or perhaps wounded prey. Shortly before midnight, a sound caught his attention, so faint that at first he thought it might be the wind. But no, there it was again, a child's cry, quickly muffled, coming from within the cabin. Nahilzai's pulse quickened. Children! Here, alone in the depths of winter. He watched more intently now, eyes narrowed against the darkness. One of the wolves, larger than the others, the alpha male, stood on its hind legs, front paws against the cabin wall, sniffing at the window. Something about its focused intensity sent a chill through Nahilzai that had nothing to do with the cold. Another cry from within, followed by a hushing sound. Then, flickering through the grimy window glass, the weak glow of a lamp being lit. The decision made itself. Nahilzai rose silently, securing his rifle. The wolves, intent on their prey, did not notice him descending from his position until he was halfway to the cabin. When the alpha male finally caught his scent, it turned with a low growl that alerted the pack. 7 pairs of eyes reflected the starlight, fixed on this new development. Nahilzai did not run. Running would trigger the chase instinct. Instead, he walked steadily forward, making himself appear larger, his hand on his knife. The wolves hesitated, caught between hunger and caution. The alpha male held its ground the longest, before finally retreating with the pack to the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. At the cabin door, Nahilzai paused. He could hear movement inside, whispers, the scrape of something heavy being pushed against the door. These children, if they were indeed children, were afraid of the wolves, of him, of everything beyond their fragile walls. "I mean no harm," he called in English, the language of the settlers. His accent was thick, but the words clear enough. "The wolves circle your home. I can help." Silence followed. Then a small voice, trembling but determined, "Go away. Our pa will be back soon with his gun." A lie. Nahilzai knew it instantly. There were no fresh adult tracks around the cabin, no horse nearby, no man out hunting in this weather. These children were alone. "Your father is not coming," he said simply. "The wolves know this. They grow hungry and bold. Let me in." More whispers inside, urgent and frightened. Finally, the sound of furniture being moved away from the door. It opened just enough for Nahilzai to see a boy's face, perhaps 10 or 11 winters old, pale and drawn with fear and something else, the hollow look of hunger. "Are you going to kill us?" the boy asked, his voice steadier than his thin shoulders. Nahilzai shook his head. "Had I wanted that, I would have left the wolves to their work." The boy seemed to consider this logic, then opened the door wider. Nahilzai stepped inside and quickly secured it behind him. The interior of the cabin was cold, despite the small fire struggling in the stone hearth. A single oil lamp cast weak yellow light over the sparse furnishings. A rough table, 2 chairs, a cupboard with a broken door, and a bed where 3 smaller children huddled together beneath a threadbare quilt. The oldest was the boy who had opened the door. His clothes were too large for his frame, likely his father's, rolled up at the sleeves and pant legs. His brown hair hung limp around a face that had known too little food and too much worry for one so young. On the bed, a girl of perhaps 8 winters held a younger girl and boy close to her sides. The smallest couldn't have been more than 3, thumb firmly in mouth, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Udaim William," the oldest boy said, chin raised in a show of courage. "That's Emma, and the little ones are Sarah and George. Our ma and pa," he faltered, swallowing hard. "Indians killed them 2 weeks ago, maybe. Been snowing so much, hard to tell the days." Nahilzai said nothing about the irony of a white child telling an Apache that Indians had made him an orphan. Instead, he moved to the window, checking its security. The glass was intact but loosely fitted in its frame. Outside, he could hear the wolves moving closer again. "You have food?" he asked, turning back to the children. William hesitated, then shook his head. "Ran out yesterday. Pa was supposed to be back with supplies, but—" His voice trailed off. "The wolves," Nahilzai said. "They smell your weakness. They have been hungry many days, as have you. Tonight, they may try to enter." Emma clutched the smaller children tighter. "Will they eat us?" she whispered. Nahilzai looked at the 4 pale faces, at the fear and exhaustion written there, and felt something stir within him. Something he had thought died with Dolly's final breath 3 winters ago. "No," he said firmly. "They will not." Nahilzai assessed the cabin with the sharp eyes of a warrior who had survived countless winters in the wilderness. The structure was sound enough. The logs still held together despite years of neglect, but cold air seeped through gaps between them. The door was solid oak, but its hinges had begun to rust. The window worried him most. The frame had warped with seasons of rain and snow, leaving spaces a determined predator might exploit. "And we need more wood for the fire," he said, moving to the small pile beside the hearth. "Barely enough to last the night." William nodded toward a corner. "There's some there, but it's too big to burn." Nahilzai examined the pile. larger logs that would indeed be too big for the fireplace without splitting. He removed his heavy outer coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "Do you have an axe?" he asked. The boy pointed to a rusty tool leaning against the wall. Nahilzai tested its edge with his thumb and frowned. Dull, but it would serve. He worked quickly, splitting the larger pieces into manageable sizes while William watched with cautious interest. Outside, the wolves had grown quieter, a more dangerous sign than their earlier growling. Silence from predators often preceded attack. "And how long have the wolves been circling?" Nahilzai asked as he worked. 3 days, I think," William replied. "At first it was just 1 or 2, then more came. They used to run when I shouted or banged pots together, but now—" He shrugged, the gesture making him look even younger. "They know you are weak," Nahilzai said matter-of-factly. "They smell your hunger." From the bed, Emma spoke up, her voice small but clear. "We tried to make the food last. Pa always said to eat slow when supplies run low." The mention of food made little George whimper. Sarah, though barely more than a toddler herself, patted his hand with the instinctive comfort one child offers another. Nahilzai added wood to the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The room gradually warmed, and with the increased light, he could better see the children's condition. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes hanging loosely on thin frames. The youngest two showed the glassy-eyed look of early starvation. Without comment, he reached into his pouch and withdrew a package wrapped in leaves. Inside was pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries that his people had made for generations. It was travelers' food, dense with nourishment and designed to sustain life in the harshest conditions. He divided it into 4 portions, giving the largest to William, who hesitated. "Eat," Nahilzai instructed, slowly. The boy took a small bite, then carried portions to his siblings. They ate with the careful restraint of children who had learned that food was precious and uncertain. "Your parents," Nahilzai said after they had eaten. "What happened?" William's jaw tightened. "Pa took Ma to the settlement for supplies. They were supposed to be back in 3 days. Then Mr. Jenkins, he's a trapper, has a cabin down the valley. He came by, said there was a raid, Apache raiders." He looked at Nahilzai with sudden wariness. "Said they killed everyone in the wagon train. Ma and Pa were with them." Nahilzai's expression didn't change, though he knew the story didn't ring true. His people had maintained an uneasy peace with the settlers in this region for nearly 2 years. The last raid had been far to the south, and his tribe had not been involved. "Jenkins wanted to take us to the fort," William continued, "but Sarah was sick with fever. He said he'd come back with help, but—" The boy's voice trailed off. "He didn't return," Nahilzai finished for him. William shook his head. "Storm came. Been snowing ever since." A sudden thump against the window made Emma gasp. One of the wolves had jumped against the glass, testing it. The pack was growing bolder. Nahilzai moved to the window. In the dim light reflected from the snow, he could see the alpha circling back for another attempt. The pack was spreading out, surrounding the cabin, cutting off any possible escape routes. "We need to secure this window," he said, turning to William. Do you have nails? Anything metal we can use?" The boy rummaged through a box beneath the bed and produced a handful of bent nails and a rusted hammer. Not ideal, but it would have to do. Nahilzai worked methodically, hammering strips of wood from a broken chair across the window frame. Each strike of the hammer elicited growls from outside, the wolves agitated by the noise but not deterred. As he worked, little Sarah slipped from the bed and approached him cautiously, clutching a threadbare doll to her chest. She watched him with solemn eyes that reminded him painfully of Dolly. "Are you really an Indian?" she asked in a whisper. "I am Apache," he replied, continuing his work. But Indians are bad. They killed Ma and Pa. Nahilzai paused, looking into her young face. Some men do bad things, he said finally. White men. Apache men. All men can choose to harm or help. She considered this with the surprising thoughtfulness of a child. Are you a helping Indian? Before he could answer, a loud crack split the night as the window glass fractured beneath the weight of a wolf hurling itself against the pane. Emma screamed. William grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace. The battle for survival had begun. The window glass splintered inward, razor-sharp fragments scattering across the cabin floor. Cold air rushed through the opening, feeding the fire into a momentary blaze that cast wild shadows on the walls. Through the jagged hole, the alpha wolf's muzzle appeared, snarling, teeth bared in a display of primal hunger. "Get back!" Nahilzai commanded the children, positioning himself between them and the window. In one fluid motion, he unsheathed his hunting knife, a blade that had tasted the blood of elk, bear, and mountain lion. William pushed his younger siblings toward the farthest corner of the cabin, shielding them with his thin body. Emma clutched Sarah and George to her chest, muffling Sarah's terrified sobs against her shoulder. The alpha wolf forced its head and shoulders through the window frame, heedless of the glass cutting into its hide. Blood matted its grey fur, but hunger had made it reckless, desperate. Behind it, the rest of the pack paced anxiously, awaiting their chance. Nahilzai did not hesitate. As the wolf struggled to pull its body through the opening, he lunged forward and buried his knife into the creature's shoulder. The wolf yelped in pain and fury, snapping its jaws at him. Its teeth caught the sleeve of his buckskin shirt, tearing the leather as if it were paper. Outside, the pack responded to their leader's distress with a chorus of howls that seemed to make the very walls of the cabin tremble. Two more wolves leapt at the window, fighting to get through, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of prey. "The wood!" Nahilzai shouted to William, never taking his eyes off the wounded alpha. "Bring me a burning log from the fire." The boy hesitated only a moment before understanding. He darted to the fireplace and seized a flaming brand, its end glowing red with embers. Nahilzai twisted his knife free from the alpha's flesh and slashed again, opening a deep cut across the wolf's muzzle. The animal recoiled but did not retreat, its yellow eyes fixed on the children huddled in the corner. "Now!" Nahilzai called. William rushed forward with the burning log. Nahilzai grabbed it and thrust the flaming end directly into the alpha's face. The wolf jerked back with a howl of pain, retreating partially through the window, but the respite was brief. A second wolf, smaller but more agile, squeezed through the gap, landing on the cabin floor with a thud. It crouched, muscles tensed, ready to spring toward the children. Nahilzai spun around and kicked the creature hard in the ribs, sending it sliding across the rough wooden floor. Before it could recover, he was upon it, knife flashing in the firelight. The wolf snapped at him, teeth closing on his forearm. Pain lanced through him as fangs penetrated flesh, but he did not cry out. Instead, with a warrior's focus honed by decades of survival, he drove his blade deep into the wolf's throat. Hot blood spilled over his hand as the animal's grip loosened, its eyes dimming. "The window!" Emma screamed. Nahilzai turned to see the alpha wolf had regained its courage and was forcing its way back through the opening, half its body already inside the cabin. Behind it, the rest of the pack crowded forward, emboldened by the scent of blood, both wolf and human. William had not been idle. The boy had grabbed the poker again and now swung it with all his strength, catching the alpha across the snout. The wolf growled but did not retreat. Nahilzai crossed the room in 2 strides, seized the creature by the scruff of its neck and plunged his knife repeatedly into its side. The wolf thrashed violently, claws raking across Nahilzai's chest, tearing through buckskin and flesh alike. For a moment, they were locked together in a deadly embrace, man and beast, each fighting with the desperation of their kind. The wolf's hot breath reeked of carrion as it snapped repeatedly at Nahilzai's throat. He could feel its strength, undiminished by wounds that would have felled a lesser creature. With a final surge of effort, Nahilzai drove his knife upward beneath the wolf's jaw, finding the soft spot where the skull met the spine. The alpha stiffened, then went limp, its weight suddenly dead against him. Blood-soaked and breathing hard, Nahilzai heaved the carcass back through the window. It landed with a heavy thud in the snow outside, where the remaining wolves circled uncertainly, their confident aggression replaced by wary hesitation. The table. Nahilzai gasped to William, pressing a hand against the deep claw wounds on his chest. "Help me." Together, they pushed the heavy oak table against the broken window, blocking the opening as best they could. Emma rushed forward with the quilt from the bed, stuffing it into the gaps to keep out the wind and prevent the wolves from seeing inside. For several long minutes, the only sounds were their ragged breathing and the occasional growl from outside as the pack sniffed at their fallen leader. Then, gradually, the wolves began to withdraw, melting back into the forest one by one. The immediate danger had passed, but the night was far from over. Blood dripped steadily from Nahilzai's arm and chest, forming dark pools on the cabin floor. His vision blurred at the edges, the familiar warning of too much blood lost too quickly. "You're hurt bad," William said, his young face solemn in the firelight. "Yes," Nahilzai agreed simply. There was no value in lying to these children who had already seen too much truth. "Or I need to close these wounds." Little Sarah stepped forward suddenly, her doll still clutched in one hand. "Ma had a sewing box," she said, "for fixing things that got broken." Emma retrieved the small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard, where their mother had hidden it along with other small valuables. Inside lay needles, spools of thread, buttons, and a pair of silver scissors that gleamed in the firelight. Nahilzai nodded in approval. "These would serve." "Water," he instructed, sinking heavily onto one of the chairs. "Boil it if you can." William filled a pot from a bucket in the corner and hung it over the fire, while Emma threaded a needle with steady hands that belied her youth. Nahilzai removed his torn shirt, revealing the full extent of his injuries. 3 deep gashes ran diagonally across his chest, still seeping blood. The bite on his forearm had punctured clean through the muscle in 2 places. The children stared at his exposed torso, not just at the fresh wounds, but at the tapestry of old scars that told the story of his life. Knife wounds, a circular puckering that could only have been made by a bullet, the jagged line left by the mountain lion years ago. "You fought lots of battles," George whispered, speaking for the first time since Nahilzai had entered the cabin. His small face showed not fear, but a child's simple awe. "Life is a battle, little one," Nahilzai replied, his voice tight with pain. "Even when no enemy stands before you." When the water boiled, Nahilzai instructed Emma to clean the wounds thoroughly. She worked with surprising gentleness, wincing each time he tensed, but never stopping. William watched intently, learning without being told that this knowledge might someday save a life. "The needle must go through both sides," Nahilzai explained, as Emma prepared to sew the first wound. "Pull the edges together like closing a torn garment." The girl nodded, her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration. The first puncture of the needle made Nahilzai inhale sharply, but he gave no other sign of pain. Sarah covered her eyes, but George watched with solemn fascination. "Our ma sewed Pa up once," William said quietly as Emma worked. "After he got caught in barbed wire, she said doctoring was women's wisdom passed down through generations." Nahilzai nodded. "Among my people as well. The healers are often women, though men must learn the basics to survive when alone." Emma tied off the last stitch on his chest wounds and moved to his arm. "These are deeper," she said with worry in her voice. "They will heal," Nahilzai assured her, though he knew the wolf's fangs had done significant damage. Such wounds often festered, and in the wilderness, infection could kill more surely than any predator. When Emma finished, she cut a clean strip from the bottom of her petticoat to use as bandages. Nahilzai instructed her to boil these as well before applying them. A practice his people had learned reduced the chance of wounds turning bad. Throughout the procedure, Nahilzai had maintained his stoic composure, but now, with the immediate task completed, the blood loss and pain began to take their toll. The edges of his vision darkened, and he found himself leaning heavily against the table. "You should rest," William said, showing the practical sense of a child raised on the frontier. "Take the bed. We can sleep by the fire." Nahilzai shook his head. "I will keep watch. The wolves may return." "Not tonight," William insisted with unexpected authority. "You saved us. Now we help you." Too weak to argue, Nahilzai allowed the children to guide him to the bed. The thin mattress offered little comfort, but to his exhausted body, it felt like a cloud. Still, he fought to keep his eyes open, scanning the cabin for any signs of danger. Sarah approached the bedside, clutching her doll. Without a word, she placed it beside him. "This is Molly," she whispered. "She keeps bad dreams away." The simple gesture, this tiny human offering her most precious possession for his comfort, stirred something deep within Nahilzai's chest that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. He nodded solemnly, acknowledging the significance of her gift. "I will guard her well," he promised. Satisfied, Sarah retreated to the fire, where her siblings were arranging blankets on the floor. William had positioned himself nearest the broken window, the fireplace poker still within reach. A child standing guard like a man, it was both admirable and profoundly sad. Despite his intention to remain vigilant, Nahilzai's body betrayed him. The warmth of the cabin, the soft sounds of the children settling, and the blood loss combined to pull him toward unconsciousness. His last sight before darkness claimed him was of the four pale faces in the firelight, huddled together like wolf cubs in a den, vulnerable, resilient, and now, somehow, his responsibility. He dreamed of Talasi that night. Not as he usually did, coughing blood, her beautiful face contorted in agony as the fever consumed her, but as she had been in life, laughing by the stream where they first met, her hands working a deer hide with practiced skill, cradling Dolly against her breast. In the dream she spoke to him, though upon waking he could not remember her words, only the feeling they left behind, a sense of purpose where before there had been only hollow existence. Dawn broke with gentle fingers of light stretching through the cracks in the cabin walls. Nahilzai opened his eyes to find George sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, watching him with unabashed curiosity. "Are you going to die?" the boy asked without preamble. "William says strong men die sometimes when wolves bite them." Nahilzai pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. His head felt light, his mouth dry with thirst, but the fog of weakness had receded somewhat. "Not today," he answered. Then, seeing the relief on the child's face, he added more gently than he had spoken in years, "Not for many days to come." William was already awake, stoking the fire with the last of the split logs. The boy moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been forced to assume responsibilities beyond his years. Emma sat near the window, carefully removing splinters of glass from the sill while keeping watch through the gaps around the table. Of Sarah, there was no sign. "The little one?" Nahilzai asked, his voice rough from sleep and thirst. "Still sleeping," William replied, nodding toward a bundle of blankets near the hearth where a small form lay curled like a dormouse in its nest. Nahilzai swung his legs over the edge of the bed, gritting his teeth against the pain that radiated from his wounds. The stitches had held through the night, but his body felt stiff, his strength diminished. Still, he had survived worse. He would recover. He reached for his shirt, then remembered its ruined state. Instead, he wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and made his way to the window, moving with deliberate care to avoid reopening his wounds. Outside, the world was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched white. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the snow, creating an illusion of serenity that belied the violence of the previous night. Of the wolves, there was no sign except for a dark stain in the snow where the alpha had fallen, and a trail of crimson droplets leading into the forest. "They won't come back," William said, joining him at the window. "Not after you killed their leader." Nahilzai was less certain. Wolves were intelligent creatures. The pack might have retreated, but hunger was a powerful motivator. They had tasted blood now, and they knew what waited inside these walls, weak prey. "Perhaps," he said, "but we should not count on their fear lasting once night returns." William's face tightened, the brief hopefulness fading from his eyes. "We can't stay here anyway. There's no food left, and barely any wood." The boy was right. The cabin, which had been their sanctuary, was quickly becoming a prison. Without supplies, they faced a choice between starvation and risking the journey to the nearest settlement, each option carrying its own deadly risks. "How far to the settlement?" Nahilzai asked, though he already knew the answer. He had scouted most of the territory over the years, mapping the expansion of white presence in his mind. "Silver Creek is 2 days' walk," William said. "Maybe 3 in snow this deep." Pa made the trip in 1 day on horseback, 2 days for a healthy adult, longer for children, one of them barely more than a toddler. And Nahilzai, while experienced in winter travel, was injured. The calculation was grim. Emma looked up from her task, her young face etched with a worry no child should have to carry. "We could die trying to get there," she said simply. "Yes," Nahilzai agreed. There was no kindness in false hope. "But we will certainly die if we stay." George stirred in his blankets, sitting up with the disoriented look of a child waking in a world still too large and complex to fully comprehend. His small face brightened when he saw Nahilzai. "You didn't die," he announced, as if confirming his earlier question had been answered favorably. Despite the gravity of their situation, Nahilzai felt his mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "As I promised." Sarah woke next, her hair a tangled nest around her flushed face. She immediately looked for her doll, relaxing when she saw it still safely on the bed where she had left it with Nahilzai. "Molly says your hurts are better," she declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Nahilzai inclined his head solemnly. "Molly is wise." The domestic scene, children waking, the morning light, the simple exchange of words, felt strangely normal, as if they were a family beginning an ordinary day. The illusion was both comforting and painful, reminding Nahilzai of mornings in his own lodge before the sickness came. But the moment passed quickly. Reality reasserted itself in the form of hungry bellies and practical concerns. "We need food," William said, returning to the central problem, and we need to decide what to do. Nahilzai considered their options. His original plan, before the wolf attack, had been to guide the children to Silver Creek and leave them there. It was the logical solution. The white settlement would take in their own, especially orphaned children. They would be fed, clothed, perhaps taken in by a family in need of extra hands, or sent to one of the missionary schools. Yet something held him back from suggesting this now. The memory of his dream, Talasi's face, her unremembered words, lingered like a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. First we hunt, he decided, then we choose our path. Emma frowned. But you're hurt, and there's no game close by. Pa said the winter drove all the animals down to the valley. Not all, Nahilzai replied. He moved to the window again and pointed to a set of tracks barely visible in the fresh snow. Small, rounded prints that moved in a bounding pattern. Snowshoe hare, close enough to catch without venturing far. William's expression brightened slightly. I can help. Pa taught me to set snares. Good. Nahilzai nodded. We will need several. And while we wait for them to work, we can search for pine nuts and winter berries. The snow has only buried them, not destroyed them. The practical plan seemed to ease some of the tension in the small cabin. Having a task, a purpose, however temporary, was a powerful antidote to despair. Emma helped Nahilzai clean and rebandage his wounds, while William fashioned crude snares from twine found in the cabin and bent nails. Sarah and George were set to the task of sorting through the remaining supplies, taking inventory of what little they had left. As Emma worked, her small fingers gentle against his torn flesh, she spoke quietly. Those Indians who killed Ma and Pa, are they from your tribe? Nahilzai met her gaze steadily. No, and I do not believe it was Apache who attacked your parents. But Mr. Jenkins said, the white trapper may have been mistaken. Or he may have lied, Nahilzai replied. My people have kept peace in these mountains for 2 winters now. The last raids were far to the south, and not by my tribe. Emma absorbed this information with a thoughtfulness beyond her years. Then who killed them? I do not know, Nahilzai admitted. But in these lands, there are many dangers. Bandits, renegades from many tribes. Even settlers who have turned to violence. The girl was silent for a moment, tying off the last of the fresh bandages. Then she said, I think you're right, because Pa always said not all Indians were bad. He traded with some, said they were fair men. Her willingness to consider that her world might be more complex than she had been told impressed Nahilzai. Children often saw truth more clearly than adults, unburdened by the weight of prejudice and assumption. Your father was a wise man, he said. By midday, they had set 6 snares in promising locations near rabbit tracks. Nahilzai had insisted on venturing outside despite his injuries, unwilling to send William alone. The boy had proven surprisingly knowledgeable about tracking, pointing out subtle signs that Nahilzai himself might have missed. A small depression where a hare had rested, a tuft of fur caught on a bramble. Your father taught you well, Nahilzai observed as they made their way back to the cabin. William nodded, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He said every man should know how to feed his family. That it was the first duty. A shadow passed over his face. I didn't do a very good job of it after they didn't come back. Nahilzai placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the gesture awkward but sincere. You kept your brother and sisters alive in a situation that would have defeated many grown men. There is no shame in needing help when the challenge is too great for one person alone. The boy looked up at him, searching his face as if to gauge the truth of his words. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, for he straightened his shoulders slightly and nodded. Back at the cabin, Emma had organized a foraging expedition of her own. With Sarah and George bundled in every piece of clothing they could spare, she had led them to a stand of pine trees visible from the cabin window. There, they had filled a small sack with pine cones, which Emma was now painstakingly breaking apart to extract the nutritious nuts within. "Mama showed me how," she explained as Nahilzai and William entered, stamping snow from their boots. She said pine nuts saved the settlers at Crooked Creek when their supplies ran out 2 winters ago. Nahilzai nodded in approval. The girl had wisdom beyond her years. Pine nuts were indeed a valuable food source, rich in the fats needed to sustain life in cold weather. His own people had harvested them for generations. The cabin felt different now, still desperately short on supplies, still vulnerable, but infused with a new energy. The children moved with purpose instead of fear, their eyes brighter, their movements more certain. Hope, even in small measure, was a powerful medicine. As the day progressed, Nahilzai inspected the broken window more thoroughly. The table barricade was effective, but impractical for long-term use. Using strips of wood salvaged from a broken chair and pieces of animal hide from his own supplies, he fashioned a temporary covering that would keep out most of the wind and snow, while still allowing light to filter through. William worked alongside him, handing him tools and materials, absorbing each step of the process with keen attention. The boy had a quick mind and capable hands. In another life, he might have made a fine apprentice to a craftsman. Sarah and George had appointed themselves Nahilzai's official helpers, though their assistance consisted mainly of passing him things he didn't need and asking endless questions about his life as an Apache. Their curiosity was boundless, untainted by the prejudices that often clouded adult perspectives. "Do you live in one of those pointy tents?" George asked, making a triangle shape with his hands. "Those are tipis," Nahilzai explained. "Indeed, the people of the plains, Lakota, Cheyenne, others, live in those. My people, the Apache, traditionally build wickiups." "What's a wickiup?" Sarah asked, stumbling over the unfamiliar word. "A dome-shaped home made of branches covered with grass, hide, or bark. Some of our people now live in lodges more like cabins, especially those who stay in one place through the seasons." "Do you have a wickiup?" George persisted. Nahilzai paused in his work. "I did. With my family, now I move with the seasons, sleeping beneath the stars or in temporary shelters." "Because your family died?" Sarah asked with the direct simplicity of a child. Emma sucked in a breath, clearly believing the question too personal, too painful, but Nahilzai merely nodded. "Yes, the sickness that the white settlers brought took them from me. My wife, Talazi, and our 3 children, we lost our ma and pa too," Sarah said, her small face solemn. "It makes a big hole inside." Nahilzai looked into the child's eyes. "So young yet already acquainted with loss no person should have to bear, let alone a child." "Yes," he agreed softly. "A very big hole." George climbed into his lap then, seemingly unaware of the impropriety of such familiarity with a near stranger, especially one from a people his kind often feared. The boy settled against Nahilzai's chest, careful of his bandaged wounds, and said with absolute conviction, "But holes can be filled up again. That's what Ma always said when I fell and made a hole in the ground. I'd just fill it with something new, Georgie." The simple wisdom of the child's words struck Nahilzai with unexpected force. Fill the hole with something new. Not to replace what was lost, nothing could replace Talasi or his children, but to create something different in the empty space grief had carved within him. He caught Emma watching him, her expression thoughtful, as if she understood the impact of her brother's innocent statement. She gave him a small, hesitant smile before returning to her task of grinding pine nuts between two stones. By late afternoon, the first of their snares had caught a snowshoe hare, a lean creature, its winter white coat stained red where the wire had cut into its neck. William returned to the cabin triumphant, holding it aloft like a trophy. The presence of fresh meat transformed the mood in the cabin yet again, this time to one approaching celebration. Nahilzai showed the children how to properly dress the hare, wasting nothing. The meat would be their dinner. The bones could be boiled for broth. The fur, though small, would be useful for patching mittens or lining boots. William watched the process with intense concentration, clearly storing away knowledge for future use. Even Emma, initially squeamish, soon joined in, her practical nature overcoming her distaste for the bloody work. As Nahilzai prepared the meat for cooking, he found himself telling the children stories of how coyotes stole fire for the people, of the great warrior Geronimo's daring escapes, of the sacred mountains where the spirits of the ancestors dwelled. The words flowed more easily than he would have expected, considering how long it had been since he had spoken at length to anyone. The children listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide, momentarily transported beyond the confines of their desperate situation. Even William, who had maintained a certain wariness despite their cooperation, seemed captivated by tales of a world so different from his own. "Do white people tell stories?" Sarah asked during a pause. "All peoples tell stories," Nahilzai replied. "It is how we understand the world and pass wisdom to the next generation. Our Ma told us stories from a big black book," George offered, "about a man named Jesus who loved everyone and did magic." "The Bible, George," Emma corrected gently. "Those aren't just stories, they're our faith." Nahilzai nodded respectfully. "Faith gives strength when all else fails." "My people have our own beliefs, but all paths seek to understand the great mystery of life." As night fell once more, they shared their humble feast, rabbit meat, pine nut paste, and a tea brewed from evergreen needles rich in vital nutrients. Compared to the hunger of previous days, it was a bounty, and the children ate with the pure appreciation that comes from having known true want. With full bellies and the cabin secure against both elements and predators, a new question hung in the air, unspoken but present in every shared glance. What would tomorrow bring? Would they attempt the dangerous journey to Silver Creek, or remain at the cabin, hoping to sustain themselves until spring thaw made travel safer? Nahilzai himself was uncertain. His wounds, while no longer bleeding, still limited his strength. The children, though resilient, were ill-equipped for a long trek through deep snow. Yet the cabin's resources were finite, and winter's grip would not loosen for many weeks to come. As he considered these challenges, he realized with some surprise that his thoughts no longer centered solely on delivering the children to safety and returning to his solitary existence. Somehow, in the space of a day, their survival had become intertwined with his own in ways he had not anticipated. The decision came to them with the dawn. Carried on the wind that moaned through the mountain passes, a storm was brewing. Nahilzai recognized the signs immediately. The sudden drop in temperature, the peculiar stillness that preceded nature's fury, the faint scent of moisture in the air that promised not gentle snow, but the kind of blizzard that could bury a man standing upright. "We cannot leave today," he announced as the children stirred from their sleep. "A great storm approaches." William joined him at the window, squinting at the slate-gray sky. "How can you tell?" "It looks the same as yesterday. The birds have gone silent," Nahilzai explained. "No creature moves in the forest. The wind carries messages for those who know how to listen." The boy looked skeptical but nodded. His experiences had taught him to respect the knowledge of those who understood wilderness ways. even if he didn't fully comprehend the methods. "What will we do for food?" Emma asked, practical as always. "Because we ate nearly everything last night. We check the snares again," Nahilzai replied, "and we prepare the cabin for the storm. If it comes, as I believe it will, we may be confined here for several days." This prediction cast a shadow over the children's faces. They had endured too much uncertainty already. The prospect of another ordeal tested their fragile resilience. Sensing their distress, Nahilzai added, "It is good fortune, not bad. The storm gives your bodies more time to regain strength before the journey, and it gives my wounds time to heal." His reassurance seemed to ease their concerns somewhat. Even in their brief time together, the children had come to trust his judgment. It was a responsibility Nahilzai felt with increasing weight, their faith in him, their dependence on his decisions. They divided the day's tasks efficiently. William and Nahilzai would check the snares and collect as much firewood as possible before the storm hit. Emma would take inventory of every possible resource in the cabin: nails, tools, fabric, anything that might prove useful. Sarah and George were assigned to stuff rags into every crack and crevice they could find to keep out the wind and cold. As Nahilzai and William trudged through the snow, the boy broke their companionable silence. "Why are you helping us? You could have left after the wolves or never stopped at all." The question caught Nahilzai off guard. Though he had asked himself the same thing more than once, he considered his answer carefully. "There is a story among my people," he began, "about a great flood that covered the earth long ago. As the waters rose, Coyote found himself stranded on a small piece of land with his enemy, Bear. They had fought many times before, but on that tiny island, they huddled together for warmth through the long night. When morning came and the waters receded, they parted ways, but neither forgot that night when survival mattered more than old hatreds." William considered this. "So we're like Bear to your Coyote." Nahilzai's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Perhaps I simply know what it is to face the wilderness alone and would not wish that fate on children." William nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, though Nahilzai suspected the perceptive boy understood there was more to it. Layers of meaning and feeling that Nahilzai himself was only beginning to recognize. Their snares had yielded 2 more hares and a grouse that had wandered into the wire by accident. It was a bounty beyond their hopes, enough meat to sustain them through several days if properly preserved. Nahilzai showed William how to build a small smoke rack from green branches, explaining how the process would allow the meat to last longer. "My father would have liked to learn this," William said quietly as they worked. "He was always trying to pick up new skills from the Indians we traded with. Said the old ways were often better than the new." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Nahilzai replied. "Many of your people see only what they wish to change about the land, not what they might learn from it." The boy helped him gather armfuls of deadwood, breaking branches into manageable pieces. His small face was serious in concentration, but there was a new steadiness to his movements, as if having a purpose and a teacher had grounded him in ways that his previous, desperate attempts to care for his siblings could not. When they returned to the cabin, arms laden with their bounty, they found it transformed. Emma had organized their meager supplies with military precision. Tools hung from nails on one wall, fabric and clothing neatly folded, every container sorted by usefulness. Sarah and George had indeed stuffed rags and pine needles into every visible crack, guided by Emma's careful supervision. "We found these too," Emma announced proudly, pointing to a small pile of root vegetables, wizened potatoes and carrots apparently overlooked in some corner of the cabin. They were under a loose floorboard in a sack, probably put there for winter storage. It was a modest find, but an important one. The vegetables would provide nutrients that meat alone could not, helping to ward off the sicknesses that came from poor diet. As the day progressed, the sky darkened ominously. The wind picked up, driving icy particles of snow against the cabin walls with increasing fury. By mid-afternoon, visibility had dropped to barely an arm's length beyond the window. The storm had arrived. Nahilzai built up the fire to its maximum safe size, creating a pocket of warmth in defiance of the howling cold outside. The children gathered close to the flames, their faces illuminated by the dancing light. With their immediate needs met and the weather making all other activities impossible, an unusual moment of peace descended upon the cabin. Sarah approached Nahilzai, where he sat repairing a tear in his buckskin shirt. Without ceremony, she climbed into his lap as she had done the previous day, this time carrying her treasured doll and a small wooden comb. "Molly's hair is all tangly," she announced. "Can you help me fix it?" The request was so ordinary, so domestic, that it momentarily transported Nahilzai back to evenings in his own lodge, when Dolly would bring him her similar small problems to solve. His hands, capable of drawing a bowstring or wielding a knife with deadly precision, seemed suddenly large and clumsy as he took the tiny comb. With surprising gentleness, he began working the knots from the doll's yarn hair. Sarah watched with solemn approval, occasionally offering guidance. "Not too hard or it hurts her," she instructed seriously. "I will be careful," Nahilzai promised, treating the task with the same respect he would give to any important work. He crossed the room. George had fallen asleep against Emma's side, his small face peaceful for the first time since Nahilzai had met him. The girl stroked her brother's hair absently while watching Nahilzai and Sarah with an unreadable expression. William sat nearby, whittling a piece of pine into what appeared to be a crude but recognizable horse. "My Dolly had a doll like this," Nahilzai said quietly, almost to himself. "Made from corn husks and decorated with beads her mother had traded for." "Dolly was your little girl?" Sarah asked. Nahilzai nodded. "Yes, she was about your age when the sickness took her." "Is she in heaven now?" the child asked. "Ma said that's where good people go when they die. My people believe that the spirits of those who have passed journey to the land beyond the sun," Nahilzai explained. "And it is a place of beauty where hunger and sickness cannot follow." Sarah considered this with the serious contemplation children often give to metaphysical concepts. "I think that's the same place as heaven," she decided, "just with a different name. So Dolly and my ma might be friends there." The simple logic of her statement caught Nahilzai by surprise. He had never considered such a possibility, that the afterlives imagined by different peoples might be one and the same, that his Talasi and this child's mother might somehow share the same eternal dwelling place despite the boundaries that had separated them in life. "Perhaps they are," he agreed softly. Emma spoke up from her place by the fire. "No, our ma always said that people are more alike than different, if only they'd take time to see it." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't believe her when Mr. Jenkins told us Indians had killed them. It didn't make sense with what she taught us." "Your mother was right," Nahilzai said. "All people know love and grief, hunger and satisfaction, fear and courage. It is only in how we express these things that we differ." The conversation might have continued, but at that moment, a particularly violent gust of wind shook the cabin, rattling the window in its frame. The temporary covering Nahilzai had fashioned bulged inward, but held. Outside, the storm's voice rose to a shriek that silenced all other sounds. Sarah pressed closer to Nahilzai's chest, her small body tense with renewed fear. Without thinking, he wrapped his arm around her protectively, as naturally as if she were his own child. "The storm cannot harm us here," he assured her, his deep voice steady and calm. "It howls because it is angry that we are safe and warm while it must remain outside in the cold." The fanciful explanation made Sarah smile despite her fear. "Silly storm," she whispered. The storm raged for 3 days, transforming the world outside into an unrecognizable landscape of white. Inside the cabin, a different transformation was taking place, one less visible but no less profound. What had begun as an alliance of necessity between Nahilzai and the children evolved into something that increasingly resembled a family. The routines they established, William helping Nahilzai check his healing wounds each morning, Emma preparing their meals with careful attention to making the supplies last, Sarah and George gathering by Nahilzai in the evenings for stories, created a rhythm that soothed the raw edges of their collective grief. On the morning of the 4th day, Nahilzai awoke to silence. The howling wind had ceased, leaving behind the deep, muffled quiet that comes only after heavy snowfall. He moved carefully to the window, mindful of the sleeping children scattered around the cabin floor. Outside, the sun sparkled on a pristine expanse of white. The snow had drifted against the cabin in waves that reached nearly to the window in places. The forest beyond was transformed, the familiar shapes of trees and rocks hidden beneath thick blankets of snow. It was beautiful and deadly, a wilderness reborn in the storm's passing. "Is it over?" William asked, joining him at the window. "The storm, yes," Nahilzai replied, "but the challenge it has left us has only begun." The boy understood immediately. "The snow is too deep for travel?" Nahilzai nodded. "For now." "The sun will help, but it will be many days before the path to Silver Creek is passable for small ones." He glanced at Sarah and George, still sleeping peacefully. William's face showed both relief and concern. Relief at the temporary reprieve from a dangerous journey. Concern at their continuing isolation. Their food stores, though carefully rationed, would not last indefinitely. "We can set more snares," the boy suggested. "And you said there might be fish in the stream that runs beneath the ice." "Yes," Nahilzai agreed. "And when the snow settles, we can search for deer that may have been stranded by the storm." The pragmatic discussion of survival woke Emma, who joined them with her usual quiet efficiency. "I can help dig a path outside," she offered. "Whoosh, we need to reach the wood pile at least." By midday, they had cleared a narrow track from the door to the stacked firewood and set several new snares in promising locations. The deep snow made movement exhausting, but Nahilzai noted with satisfaction that both William and Emma worked without complaint, their bodies already stronger than when he had first found them. Sarah and George made it a game to pack snow against the cabin walls for additional insulation, following Nahilzai's instructions with serious dedication to their important mission. Their laughter as they worked was perhaps the most precious resource of all, a sign that their spirits remained unbroken despite all they had endured. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, Emma asked the question that had been forming in all their minds. "What happens when the snow melts enough for travel? Will you take us to Silver Creek then?" A heavy silence followed her words. The question wasn't just about logistics, it was about their future. About whether what they had built together in this small cabin had meaning beyond immediate survival. Nahilzai stared into the flames, choosing his words carefully. "That was my plan when I found you. It would be the expected thing. The white settlement would take you in, find homes for you. Would they keep us together?" William asked, his arm instinctively going around George's shoulders. "I cannot say," Nahilzai admitted. "Often, Such children are separated if no family can take all. Sarah's small face crumpled at this news. "I don't want to be away from William and Emma and George," she whispered, clutching her doll tighter. "And what about you?" Emma asked, her keen eyes fixed on Nahilzai. "Would you just leave us there and go back to being alone?" The directness of her question struck him like a physical blow. Would he? Could he simply deliver these children into the hands of strangers and return to his solitary existence in the mountains? A week ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Now, he was no longer certain. "I do not know," he said honestly. William leaned forward, his young face earnest in the firelight. "You could stay with us, or we could stay with you." The suggestion hung in the air, fragile as morning mist. Nahilzai felt something shift within his chest, a door long closed, creaking open just a fraction. "The white settlement would not allow an Apache to take white children," he said, though the words tasted bitter. "And my people. Some would welcome you, but others would remember only that your kind brought the sickness that took so many of our loved ones. So we belong nowhere," Emma said quietly, her usual practicality giving way to a moment of naked vulnerability. "No," Nahilzai responded, surprising himself with the firmness of his tone. "You belong where you are valued, where you are loved." The word slipped out before he could catch it. Love. A concept he had banished from his vocabulary after burying his family, believing that to love again was to invite more pain, more loss. Yet, here it was, unavoidable as the sunrise. George crawled into his lap then, settling against him with complete trust. "I think we belong with you," the boy said simply. "You saved us from the wolves." Sarah nodded vigorously. "And you fixed Molly's hair." Even William, usually so cautious, looked at Nahilzai with hope barely concealed behind his serious expression. Only Emma maintained a hint of skepticism, her practical nature requiring more than sentiment. "How would it work?" she asked. "Where would we live? What would we eat? How would we survive?" Valid questions all, and ones that Nahilzai himself had been considering as the possibility took shape in his mind. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "of the valley beyond Thunder Ridge. There is good water there, fertile soil, game in abundance. It is far from both white settlements and Apache camps, but not so remote that trade would be impossible." "You mean build a new home?" William asked, a new light entering his eyes. Nahilzai nodded. "A new beginning. For all of us." Spring came to the mountains with deliberate gentleness that year, as if nature sought to make amends for winter's brutality. The snow retreated gradually, revealing the earth in patches of brown and green. Streams swelled with meltwater, their voices growing from whispers to confident songs that echoed through newly awakened forests. For Nahilzai and the children, the changing season marked the culmination of a journey that had begun in desperation, but would end in hope. They had survived the remainder of winter in the cabin, their days filled with hunting, gathering, learning, and increasingly planning. Every evening, they had gathered around rough maps drawn in the dirt floor, discussing the valley that would become their new home. Now, as the last of the snow made travel possible, they prepared for departure. The cabin that had been their sanctuary would be left behind, but not forgotten. "We should mark it somehow," William suggested as they packed their meager belongings. "So we remember." Nahilzai considered the boy's words. "Among my people, important places are often marked with symbols that tell their story." Emma, who had been carefully wrapping dried meat in cloth, looked up with interest. "What symbol would tell our story?" "The wolf and the eagle," Nahilzai replied without hesitation. The wolf that threatened but ultimately brought us together, and the eagle that represents freedom and new beginnings. William nodded with solemn approval. Together, they carved the symbols into the wooden beam above the door, a crude but recognizable wolf with an eagle soaring above it. Beneath, William insisted on carving 5 small marks representing each of them. So anyone who finds this place will know 5 people became a family here, he explained. The word family no longer felt strange to Nahilzai's ears. Over the weeks of shared survival, it had become the most natural description of what they now were, bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the night they had faced death together and emerged victorious. Their journey to Thunder Ridge Valley took 3 days. Nahilzai carried Sarah on his shoulders when her small legs grew tired. George rode on a travois that William had helped construct, napping among their supplies during the most difficult stretches. Emma walked steadily beside them, occasionally reaching for Nahilzai's hand when the path grew steep. When they finally crested the ridge that gave them their first view of the valley, even Nahilzai, who had seen it before, caught his breath at the beauty spread before them. Spring had touched this place earlier than the higher elevations, painting it in vivid greens and the delicate pastels of early wildflowers. A clear stream wound through the center like a silver ribbon, and in the distance, a small herd of deer grazed peacefully. "It's like the Garden of Eden," Emma whispered, recalling stories from her mother's Bible. "It's like the land beyond the sun," Nahilzai countered, "but one we can touch and build upon in this life." They made their first camp beneath a stand of cottonwoods near the stream. That night, as the children slept soundly after their long journey, Nahilzai sat alone by the fire, reflecting on the path that had led him here. He thought of Talasi and his children, of the emptiness that had driven him into solitude, of the night he had spotted smoke rising from a small cabin in the wilderness. "I have not forgotten you," he whispered to the stars, believing that somewhere, somehow, his first family could hear him. "But I have found a way to fill the empty places you left behind. I think you would approve." The breeze that rustled the new leaves overhead seemed to carry a whisper of assent. The weeks that followed were filled with labor and purpose. Nahilzai taught the children to build a wickiup in the Apache tradition, but incorporating elements of the cabin construction they were familiar with. William proved particularly adept at woodworking, his small hands surprisingly skilled with the tools Nahilzai fashioned for him. Emma took charge of creating a garden, carefully planting seeds they had salvaged from the cabin's supplies and wild edibles Nahilzai showed her how to transplant. Her practical nature found perfect expression in this work, nurturing life from the soil, ensuring their future sustenance. Sarah and George became the gatherers, learning to identify useful plants under Nahilzai's patient guidance. They returned from their expeditions with fistfuls of berries or medicinal herbs, their faces glowing with the pride of contribution. As spring deepened into summer, their small homestead took shape. The wickiup expanded into a more permanent lodge. The garden flourished. Meat and fish, smoked and dried, hung in the storage shelter William had helped construct. They were not merely surviving now, but building a life. One evening, as they sat outside their home watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple, Sarah climbed into Nahilzai's lap as had become her custom. "Are you our father now?" she asked with characteristic directness. The question silenced the casual conversation among the others. All eyes turned to Nahilzai, awaiting his answer. He looked at each of them in turn, William no longer quite so thin, his eyes reflecting intelligence and growing confidence. Emma, her practical nature now balanced by the softness that comes with security. George, who had begun to speak more, his childish fears giving way to curiosity, and Sarah looking up at him with complete trust. "If you wish it," he said finally. "I cannot replace the father you lost, just as none of you can replace the children I buried, but perhaps we can be something new together, a family built not on what we have lost, but on what we have found." William was the first to respond, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd be proud to call you father." Emma nodded, tears glistening in her eyes but a smile on her lips. "Me too." "And me," George added enthusiastically. Sarah, already secure in her claim, simply snuggled closer against Nahilzai's chest. That night, after the children had gone to sleep in their new home, Nahilzai sat alone by the fire, watching the sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. He thought of the long journey that had brought him here, not just the physical distance from his old life to this valley, but the emotional path from devastating loss to unexpected redemption. He had not sought this role, had not imagined, in those dark days after burying his family, that his heart could expand again to include 4 pale-skinned children whose language and ways were so different from his own. Yet here he was, reborn as a father, given a second chance at the life he had thought forever lost to him. "Nahilzai," William's voice broke into his thoughts. The boy stood in the doorway of their lodge, backlit by the gentle glow of the interior fire. "You should be sleeping," Nahilzai said, though without reproach. William came to sit beside him, his young face serious in the firelight. "I've been thinking about our names," he said. "Your names are good names," Nahilzai replied. "They honor your parents who gave them to you." "I know," the boy agreed, "but I was wondering. In your tribe, when do children receive their Apache names?" Nahilzai considered the question carefully, understanding its significance. "Often at birth, but sometimes after a significant event in their lives. Their first hunt, an act of bravery, a vision." William nodded thoughtfully, "Like surviving a wolf attack." "Yes," Nahilzai agreed with the hint of a smile. "That would qualify." The boy was silent for a moment, then said, I think we should have both. Our birth names to remember where we came from, and Apache names to mark where we're going." The wisdom in the child's words touched Nahilzai deeply. "That is well thought," he said. "When the next full moon comes, we will hold a naming ceremony." William smiled, satisfied, and leaned against Nahilzai's side with the natural ease that had developed between them. Together, they watched the stars wheel overhead, father and son not by blood, but by the stronger bonds of choice and love. In the years that followed, the story of Nahilzai and the 4 orphaned children became legend in both Apache camps and white settlements. Traders who visited their valley brought back tales of the unusual family, the warrior who had found healing by adopting those he once considered enemies, the children who learned to live in 2 worlds and were richer for it. Some disapproved, some marveled. But those who actually made the journey to Thunder Ridge Valley and saw them together, Nahilzai teaching William to track deer through the forest, Emma mixing traditional medicines with knowledge gleaned from her mother's remedies, Sarah and George playing games that combined elements of both cultures, understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a family that transcended the boundaries others had drawn between peoples. And on winter nights, when snow blanketed the valley and wolves could be heard howling in the distance, Nahilzai would gather his children close and retell the story of how they came to be a family, of a desperate night, a battle for survival, and the healing power of love that could fill even the deepest holes left by loss. In this way, the legend lived on, passed from generation to generation, a testament to the truth that family is not defined by blood or appearance or the language of one's birth, but by the courage to open one's heart to unexpected possibilities and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes salvation comes not in the form we expect, but in the form we most need.